Hey everybody, my name is Alec and this is Bento Radio. Now if you really like the show, be sure to subscribe to it wherever you're getting it, whether that be YouTube if you're watching me or on any of your favorite podcast apps. And if you absolutely love the show, be sure to leave the show a comment on the YouTube video, or if you can rate the show on your favorite podcast app, of choice. Be sure to give it a 5-star rating. That really helps the show. Share the show with friends. All that fun stuff. On the note of the show, though, I will be going to Anime NYC as press again this year. Special thanks to the Anime press team, which keeps having me back. So look out for hopefully an interview, maybe a couple interviews, and daily coverage of how the show goes, because I really love doing that. So if you want to find that or any of the other stuff I've written about anime, you can look at bento-box.ghost.io. That's the show's official page and blog of sorts. But so that's all that. So now, without further ado and without further agony, I promise, we're jumping into what we're talking about this week, and that is a little show from this season called Witch Hat Atelier. So take it away, with the synopsis.
Witch Hat Atelier is a fantasy manga about a young girl named Coco, who dreams of becoming a witch in a world where only a select few are believed to be born with magical talent. Coco's life changes when she secretly watches the mysterious witch Kaifri cast a spell, and discovers that magic isn't an innate gift at all. It's created by drawing intricate magical glyphs with special ink. Excited to try it herself, Coco accidentally performs a forbidden spell that turns her mother to stone. Racked with guilt, Coco becomes Kaifri's apprentice, hoping to learn enough magic to undo what she's done. Alongside fellow apprentices Agate, Tetia, and Riche, she studies spellcraft, magical ethics, and the responsibilities that come with wielding such power.
Now there's a plot synopsis out of the way. The thing that really impressed me about this show is not just its world building, not just its craft, and actually I think I have it somewhere, although it's actually the top volume of the set, which hilariously is mostly out of frame, which means I need to resync it, but it's the top volume of the manga stack right next to me. I have the first volume of this manga, and I tried reading the first volume of this manga because Witch Hat Atelier is on the top of a lot of lists of people whose manga opinions I look to, and I couldn't get into it. And this is the thing that happens with some manga, I think, that are interested in the story as a whole, but not as interested in the setting. The setting is made to be a real background character to what's happening with the actual characters. Another thing that I think suffers from this is Chainsaw Man. I think that a lot of Chainsaw Man's quality is in its character storytelling and not necessarily its setting storytelling. But I think the problem is so strong there that it extends the show. Like that show feels like it takes place nowhere, if that makes any sense. It feels like the locations you're seeing in the show are so pedestrian they would never stand out. Whereas something, to give you an example of the complete opposite, something like, particularly Hayao Miyazaki does this a lot. Something like Hayao Miyazaki stuff, or something like Cardcaptor Sakura is an incredible version of this. The settings in those have so much character and so much beauty that they are additive. And I'm not saying that one way is a better way or another. I'm just saying that if I'm watching or reading something and it feels like I can't place it in space, there's going to have to be a little extra lifting for me to get to where the thing wants me in terms of a viewer. And what happened with the first volume of the manga is, even with the river that has a magical seal that continuously cleans it, even with beautiful scenery that's very much like European countryside scenery, I think it didn't hook me right away. And so I just put it aside. I still have the first volume, but I saw the quality that people liked in it, and I've heard enough about it where I think I'm going to wait to watch this and see what they do with it. And what Bug Films has done with it is absolutely gorgeous. The setting feels more grounded. It feels like it's not this skeleton of a thing that they're loading stuff into, it feels like the world exists in its entirety regardless of the characters, which I always like in the setting of something. And the main story start aside, this show about artistry, the beginning phases of professional artistry, and the beginning phases of being a craft person, very specifically, because the way that they set up magic in this show is very different from the way that they set up magic in Frieren or something. The story of Wand and Sword magic is very much a Harry Potter model. Everybody has a wand, has specialties. It very much feels like Harry Potter fan fiction in a way. I'm not saying that's bad, but I am saying that Harry Potter, a framework, however flawed it is, thank you, what's their food? Name I'm remembering, and I don't feel bad about it because she's an awful person. That gives this sense of a framework feels very prescriptive to magic, and feels like magic is more utilitarian. In Frieren, you have this framing of folk magic, and of a kind of magic in Frieren is very much a transitional phase, because folk magic is still in the world, but less and less people are using it in that way, and part of the project in Frieren, a character, is to utilitarianize the idea of magic as a thing of strength and about service and about all the other things, and part of the thing drives Zeria nuts. Frieren isn't like that. Frieren is going around the world collecting folk magic that one person up with decades ago for a very specific reason that most people would never have. And Frieren treats the craft of magic like an enthusiast. Zeria treats the craft of magic like a professional, if that makes any sense. And what you have in Witch Hat Atelier is this treatment of magic before even where something like enthusiasm kind of meet and come into it. And what you see in Coco is somebody who has a lot of enthusiasm for magic but didn't understand the craft, so when she encountered a higher for the craft that she doesn't understand, she had the enthusiasm to attempt it, but not the I don't like professional knowledge, but not the context to know what might happen. And that kind of the first the story goes is that she, by the way, spoiler alert for all of Witch Hat Atelier, all the 13 episodes out at this point at which I'm recording this. But the results of her not understanding what could happen are that her mother gets frozen in crystal. But what happens is Kefri takes the kind of call everybody witches, regardless of the male or female, which I kind of great that they just witch as a gender-neutral term. It's not witches or wizards. It's just everybody's a witch, which I love. But Kefri, the witch who's up there to her atelier, is kind of for her being enthusiastic enough to really take a real shot at this journal that she was given as a younger child by what they call Brindcaps in this universe. And Brindcaps are a malevolent force created by bureaucracy. It's the best way I can say it. They are people who want to practice the craft of magic without limit. And they have all kinds of powers that people came up in the system that is much more structured and much more prescribed don't, because they are exploring without limits what the limit of magic is. This is the Brindcap at the end of the first 13 episodes, who is no longer really a body. She is a hat with an eyeball in it and a cape. And that's her body. How much she screwed around with magic is that essentially she turned herself into her own clothes on some level. But the kind of episode to episode treatment of the show is very much one about being a craft person who is a apprentice. And I think This is coming from somebody who came up through the professionalized creative. I think the modern version of apprenticeships has it's a noble idea that isn't there anymore. And what I mean by that is, if you're doing an apprenticeship and you're not getting paid well and you keep living, that's not an apprenticeship. Because the idea about apprenticeship is that it's supposed to be set up a system where you can learn the craft of something, whether that be making art, HVAC units, what have you, with a reasonable expectation that you won't fail too hard. It's about setting up a scenario in which your successes can be magnified and your failures are minimized. And I feel like most scenarios where someone's ascribing an apprenticeship, that's not really what's happening anymore. But in this show, the idea of being an apprentice, which is what they literally call it that, is learning how to do the act of magic. And it turns out the act of magic is a cross between drawing, it is a sigil drawing. Like the magic system is sigil magic system, and the magic isn't actually in people. Magic is in everyone. But what they've done in the case of the show is they said magic may be in everyone, but the ability to use it can be extremely, incredibly, wildly. They start this off this way by showing you what happens when Coco attempts magic and causes her mother to be frozen in crystal. Along with their entire house and business, by the way. It's not just like she turned her mom to stone. The entire house is stone in the countryside. It's just this big crystal thing. And so part of the job of witches is to keep the craft secret and contained to those who know it and those who are born into it. And it's very rare that someone like Coco comes into the craft of magic from the outside. And the way they do that is they very closely guard, specifically, the way you draw the sigils and the ink, because the ink is very specifically the part that makes everything magic. You can draw the sigils with anything, but the ink is what allows it to draw on all the powers of the world and do the thing. And so you have a great setup in that, because you have a setup where the viewer can feel like you're watching a unique group of people, but unlike many shows that are power fantasy to some degree, you feel like you're spending time with unique and powerful individuals, but they never let you forget that these people are trying to keep this a secret from everybody. They're living in a world of magic and wonder, but everybody else is essentially living in the Middle Ages. And they do a great job of making sure of fantasy Middle Ages, rather. But they do a great job of making sure that these people are not normal people, that Coco is not among normal people now. She is among a class of respected and called upon craft people who guard their craft. If you ever wondered if this happens now, it almost always happens now. Very often, this is done in professional settings with language. So, the difference between a graphic designer, one of the big differences between a graphic designer and a non-graphic designer is lots of non-graphic designers will regularly say things like font. Graphic designers say typeface. And the reason for that is that separates them out from everybody else, but it also protects them because it's a in-the-know thing. If I'm talking to you about typography and typefaces, and you're talking to me about font use, it's just, I know that you are not trained. You are not, somebody hasn't beat that into your head yet. Not that you can't get there, not that you can't go learn this stuff, but you can't hang at the same level to say I would if I was in a setting with other graphic designers or other creatives. And part of what people hate about AI is that it gives people this false notion that they can end run around that. But in reality, the big thing that people found, including me, with their exploration of AI tools, especially gendered ones, is if you know something about what you're doing, if you know a fair amount about what you're doing, AI can be a really rewarding and capable tool. But that's not the way anybody's pushing to use it. What they're pushing to use it is as full replacement. It is come up with this advertising campaign. Make these fashion photo shoot or product photography shoots. And it can't do that. Because AI can't make anything new. What it essentially is it's a really detailed collage engine. And what I mean there is it's taking the full corpus of everything it has access to every time and mixing it down to the appropriate part to give you an image or a paragraph or a video or what have you. So it can't do things like portray a specific city because that specificity is not what it's built for. And so in that way, people who have trained in any kind of craft, from photography to illustration to animation to film, look at AI as a generative tool as being incapable. Because it can make something that's fantasy, it can make something that's good enough, but it can't make something that's excellent. And that's the problem. And in this show, very clearly believes in the practice of artistry, the studying of art. So the thing I always find interesting and ultimately a little frustrating is creative scenarios like what you find in a lot of Rebecca Sugar shows. And that is that the entirety of their creative scenario is about art school. You see this in certainly in parts of Steven Universe. You see this in High Guardian Spice. Actually, you see it the most. In High Guardian Spice, you see it to a painful degree. In that you see people trying to recreate their art school experience. Or specifically the college experience, because for a lot of people, college is really important and a really formative time, and you make a lot of... I've made a lot of connections. Most people make a lot of connections in that time period because you are an adult with your full faculties, but you're also not in the adult world where you have to keep everything going quite as much. If you're not lucky, you're already in the adult world and you're putting up with college at the same time, and that sucks. But what people kind of almost forget to do in those scenarios, they forget to show a really complete, in my opinion at least, a really complete experience of what it is to sit and learn and be taught and all of the things that go with learning a craft and being an apprentice. Because essentially, modern art school is apprenticing under multiple different teams, multiple different teachers and artists. And you pick up different things from those different artists along the way that then hopefully help you inform what you're going to do. But in Witch Hat Atelier, what they get really right is they get really right the feeling of what it is to be an apprentice and the kind of molds of being apprentices. And they do a great job in not just Coco, but also Ricci and Agathe, and I think it's Tati, I think is the pink-haired girl's name. Across those three characters, you get great examples of different types of apprentices and different paths through their apprenticeship that result in different attitudes towards learning and attitudes towards magic and all these things. So Agathe is very headstrong, and she wants to be out in the world, and she wants to be fully realized and be a professional and be doing the job. Ricci is probably the most interesting here because Ricci does not want to take orders from authority and wants to be allowed to do her own thing. And she doesn't like depending on what's existed before. She wants to make something new. Tati is we'll get to her in a second, but she's actually pretty interesting too. They're all interesting. Coco is just has this pure enthusiasm and want to learn, first for just her pure love of magic and of the world of magic, but also ultimately to help her mother. She has a big, noble hero goal that she's trying towards, but she also just loves the craft of the thing. And let's go to Tate for a second here, though, because I think that's to Tati, I think is her name. The pink-haired, slightly Irish one. Although they're all slightly Irish, weirdly, in the English stuff. She doesn't actually want to be necessarily a witch who's working out in the world. She is trying to learn to be a witch so she can teach other people. This is something you encounter every once in a while in specifically art school, is that you encounter people who want to learn how to do it and who want to go out into the world and do it, but then they also want to come back and teach the generation after them. I've known a couple people who have been specifically in FIT actually. When I was in pre-college as a teenager in FIT, I knew people who, I want to be a teacher. And at first it confused me, but we're all here to learn to go out and do this. You want to learn to do this so you can come back and teach it. That's weird, or at least it was weird to me at the time. Now it's way less weird to me because I understand that that's a love of it that's so deep that you want to share it with other people in a way that's not built to be consumerist. Because the bottom line is, and the show gets at this a little, and it's a kind of creative pursuit, is both involves passion for it, but when you're doing it as a business, as a way to make a living, it also involves, you have to be dispassionate about it at a point. You have to set deadlines. You have to deliver something to people. You are making your creative output into a product. That's what I'm doing here with this podcast. I'm making a creative thing. I'm engaging in creation of video and imagery. And my light just shut off, but it's fine. And stuff like that as a product. And that product is obviously sometimes imperfect, but is obviously also you have to think about that. And you have to think through that as if you have to think about that in a different way. And then you have Ricci, and Ricci has had a much different path. And they've all had different paths from each other, but Ricci has this path that is very complicated because she is incredibly talented. She's talented to the point where you would describe her as being gifted and being like, if she was in art school, she would probably be the most talented person in her class. But she had no interest in doing anything she's not interested in, which I know sounds crazy, but she doesn't want to do things that other people have done. She wants to be a full-fledged witch, but she wants to do it entirely on her own terms, without taking instruction and without learning. It feels like she's almost been forced into the apprentice role, and she would rather just go out and do it with what she has. But the thing about that everyone's trying to give her is that you don't know enough. What you know is incredible. What you know might be, and probably will be, incredible enough to work out for you, but it's not. Her knowing more will give her more and will make her more capable than she otherwise would be, and she just isn't there yet. And the last episodes of the show where they're doing the snake pass test really stresses that and really shows that to her, because Kiefer basically is like, hey, you're taking this test too? And she's like, no, I don't want to. And he's like, trust me. And she's like, fine. And then the plot of those episodes occurs, and she learns stuff about herself. But what you see in Kiefer is, and let's talk about Kiefer here actually for a second. But what you see in Kiefer is somebody who's genuinely trying to be a good teacher, who's genuinely trying to be a good steward of the craft, and trying to support and nurture his students. What you see in other witches who have apprentices is something very different. And this is a problem with art teachers many times. A good art teacher will support you in what you're trying to do and will try and get you to where you're trying to go with a project or in life or what have you. A bad art teacher imposes their own thing on you. And what I mean there, and I've had both, by the way. What I mean there is, if you're watching the show and you see Kiefer as a character, when somebody makes a mistake, his version of correcting it looks very different from, you did this wrong. Why would you ever do that? Rather than what he actually does. This is why what happened with your spell just happened. And this is how you can apply that to be a positive, even if you didn't want that to happen here. And you see that most acutely with Coco, who's the newest to this whole world of magic. And in doing that, you see Coco grow as a witch, and as an apprentice witch, in that she applies what she's been told Not just when she did something correctly, but when she did something incorrectly, and she'd been given all the puzzle pieces to make a new thing within the frame. And that's the sign of a really good teacher. And as if to drive that point home, in the last arc, in the Snake Path arc, at the very beginning of it, you meet a character. I'm going to hold the character list up here because I want to reference his character names very specifically. You meet a character by the name of, and everybody's weird, very specific, crosses between a bunch of different European old-style names in this, so I want to get them right. You encounter a character of, oh god, where is it? I'm going to call him Ennui, but his name is spelled Euini. You encounter, and he's an apprentice for a different witch, who's an older gentleman, who is verbally abusive, for lack of a better term. He's fully verbally abusive towards his apprentice. He treats his apprentice like his apprentice knows nothing and will never know as much as he knows. I forget the guy's name. I don't actually think I caught it. But he is so verbally abusive that Ennui has no confidence and believes not only that he can't succeed, but that success specifically for him is impossible. And it takes his interaction with other apprentices who have been better taught and more nurtured to gain any kind of confidence and be able to do anything and see a path to success for himself and see the knowledge that he has gained, even through a flawed apprenticeship, is valuable and is useful. And that he can take his own destiny into his own hands and take his creative process into his own hands and do it in his own way. That way that he's been taught has been correct to the letter of it, but incorrect in the spirit of it. And you see this in Ricci, too. Part of the reason why Ricci is so opposed to any kind of authority figure telling her what to do is that her first apprenticeship in her first apprenticeship, which she was apprenticing under, didn't properly adjust to the kind of student they had. So I'm going to tell a little anecdote here, but as a disabled person, went through school largely in special education classes. And that's for a lot of reasons, but the primary reason is when I was in first grade, I was not reading at a first grade level in first grade, so the choice was made to hold me back a year and put me in special education. And the problem, if you know anything about special education in America, is once you're in, it's very hard for you to get out, because the entire system is then built around you to not only assist you, but to keep you there, because I don't know how it is now, because I haven't been in public school in a long time, but how it was when I was in public school, is every kid with what's called an IEP, which is an individualized educational plan, you get twice as much money as a school district for that child as you would get for a child who doesn't have one. So essentially, the kid with an IEP plan becomes a kind of cash cow for the district. And so what that means for the kids, though, if they outgrow their IEP or they outgrow the special education class structure, they're often kept there because as a whole, they're more valuable in that class than they are in normal classes, even. So there came a point at which it wasn't that I was smart, it wasn't that I was incredibly intelligent, although I'm sure people might describe me as that. It was that I just wasn't in the place where special education courses were doing me any good anymore. I could have been in classes not with normal kids, I could have been in the normal level classes with the general student body. And so I became impatient. I did things like take naps in the middle of class because I didn't have anything to do. And in that way, the education system failed me because it didn't adjust for the kind of student I was because it didn't have a way to. And it was so resistant to doing that. In Ennui and Ricci's backstories, you see a system that allows for that to a greater degree than almost it allows for people like Kiefer. Because the idea behind Kiefer is Kiefer had done something incredibly dangerous by inviting an outsider in, but an outsider who has been tapped by the brimmed caps, who I'm going to talk about in a second, and like it's normal. It's acting like this is what you should be doing. And here's what I want to talk about the brimmed caps, because I think there's something really interesting about the brimmed caps on two levels. Because the brimmed caps are very clearly evil until you find out the backstory of the world of Witch Hat Atelier. The fact that magic is so capable, it can do things like heal broken bones, cure ailments, give people their full sight back in the case of one character, potentially, but it just doesn't. And there was a big fight about this. In the kind of the history of the show, there was a big fight between witches who practice healing magic and the, forget what they call their like witch tower thing, the thing that represents the governmental organization that oversees all witches. But there was a big gap between that governmental organization and witches who practice healing magic, because witches who practice healing magic were banned from their practice, from doing that, because it was deemed that applying magic to human beings in any way is too risky and too dangerous to be tolerated. And the thing that Jeffrey says, he's like, when human beings figured out they could do anything, is exactly what they did. And that included whole-scale slaughter, war stuff. And so the kind of system of keeping magic secret and being very guarded about it was put in place, and limits on what you can and should do within that system were put in place to keep the worst from happening. And this is a thing, and I'm going to talk about AI here for a second. Part of the reason why AI can't make anything that's not good enough is because it has too many guardrails. It's too considered of... I know this sounds crazy, and I know people are saying, should have more guardrail, blah. But bear with me here. As a hammer doesn't care what you do. That's why you can be violent with a hammer. As a tool of art, the pencil doesn't care what you draw. That's why you can draw the most abhorrent, awful, inconceivable things you can imagine. But as a tool, AI, it won't allow you to draw anything pornographic. It won't allow you to draw many things that have to do with crime or criminality. It won't, famously, they at least at first blush won't let you do things like figure out how to make a bomb. And while figuring out how to make a bomb is probably good that most people can't do that, you need access to that knowledge in order to be a full creative person. You need access to the knowledge of how to draw children. Not because you want to be gross, but because you might need to draw children in your show. This is a perfect example of that. In Witch Hat Atelier is a show with underage characters, primarily. It's not gross about it, it's not lurid, but if you tried to make something like this with a modern generative app, you wouldn't be able to. Because most of those are functioning on the idea, if we allow someone to generate pictures of children, you would just a hop, skip, and a jump away from inappropriate, awful, terrible things. But a person does make those judgment calls. And believe me, I know, in anime, there is tons of material. Some of it will be talked about here yet. For different reasons, never those reasons. This poster is actually a perfect example of it. Sometimes that stuff is going to happen, but that doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that, I've always thought that was a really good, I'm just checking to see what time it is, example of, I think that this is probably the best example of that in the text of a show, is that magic is this huge big deal. We need to put constraints on it, or else it'll go out of control. The point of the brimmed caps, and kind of slowly the point of the show, is you will, like, that stuff is out there. Telling people they can't do it only makes them want to explore it more, and you're going to create a class of people. That's what they do. On the fan fiction sites, I'm sure, especially the manga ones, I'm sure that there's a slight overrunning problem of people trying to make fan fiction and fan work with AI. And that's people trying to push against that thing as a tool to try and get more out of it. That's a natural thing. It's not a antagonistic thing. It's something that people try to do with the tools they're given every time. And in this case, you have the Bryn Cats, who have over time become fanatic lunatics, essentially. But in practice are just people who want full access to the art that everyone's practicing, who don't stop at what the prescribed allowances are. And at all these different turns, the adult characters say things about magic of, oh, the reason why we have hospitals and the reason why hospitals, even though we have magic, and the reason why hospitals are so hit or miss still, is because someone at the top is stopping us from doing this, because as soon as you allow for that, you start to allow for a lot of horrible human experimentation stuff. And we can't in good conscience go beyond that. But then you meet a character who's because in this universe their equivalent of wands is pens because they draw the sigils. You meet a character who is supposed to be able to be a witch, but he can't because he's colorblind. And if you've been paying attention to that point, why is this kid colorblind? He could just not be colorblind. And the show fully says this on screen. Kiefer says this to Coco. He goes, Witch society isn't great because we're pretty ableist about everything, it turns out. Eliminating healing magic and eliminating the ability to heal what ails people turns you in a pretty ableist place pretty quickly. And I love that gradation. I love that nuance to that show. I love the nuance to Kiefer as a character, and that Kiefer has very clearly lost something and is just on the good side of reckless in regard to trying to get revenge for, get back whatever he lost. And I think this is a really excellent show. If you haven't watched it, if you've been dancing around watching it, I encourage you to go check it out. This is actually where I'll leave it. So, yeah.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and if you did, be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening or watching. If you're listening to it on a podcast platform and they allow you to give a 5-star review, be sure to do that. If you're watching this on YouTube and you really liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and like the video. In addition, if you want to make sure that you don't miss a beat, be sure to hit that notification bell so you know when new episodes drop. But if you're wondering, they drop every Thursday night Eastern time. And on that note, if you really love the podcast, and you really love what I'm trying to do here, be sure to give the website a look. That website is bento-box.ghost.io. There will be a link in the description of either this podcast or this video. It'll also be linked in the description of the entire podcast on the information page. It'll also be linked in the description of the YouTube channel. So there's plenty of ways for you to get to that website and check it out. If you want to follow me, my social links are also listed in the footer of that page. So once again, go over there to find that stuff. But I hope you liked the episode. I look forward to talking to you next time. But until next time, I have been Alex. This has been Bento Radio, and I'll talk at you later.